Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Some good news, but not today. Deadline's coming up, exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline to file tomorrow, June 9th, and end of day, 11 to 9:59 p.m. And exam number 3, covering part 3, stuff we're talking about in epistemology and metaphysics. Deadline to file is on June 17th, and then exam 4, covering part 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, which is the final, covering all the stuff. Deadline to file end of day, June 18th. And for the paper, if you want to do a draft, be sure to get a copy to me by Wednesday, and then you can do.
So, chapter 4, test 4, and the exam, the last exam was June 18th?
Yes, exam 4, and quizzes part 4, exam number 5, deadline on June 18th. For the draft, again, you can do as many drafts as you want. Until I'll put, like this one, I'll mark them up, put a tentative grade on it, give it back to you, and then you can keep doing them if you want until either you get the grade you want, or you get sick of the process, or time ends. Again, there's no penalty for not doing the draft. For the final version of the paper, if you want to get the +5 bonus, be sure to upload it to Blackboard by June 11th, end of day, and get your base score +5. If you want just full credit, be sure to upload it to Blackboard by end of day, June 15th, and you get the full credit. If you want half credit, be sure to upload it to Blackboard by the end of day, June 18th, and you'll get half credit. And then the grades go in on June 19th. So if you have, be sure to check your overall grades on the 18th, and then it was a good plan while it lasted. Okay, so be sure to check your overall grades on the 18th, because I'll be putting the final grades on the 19th, and once the final grades are in, the approved grades are in, then very difficult to change them. So be sure to check your grades and make sure everything is done by end of day on the 18th, and that way everything will be smooth for the 19th. Before heading to the new stuff, anything about any previous stuff or stuff to be that needs more stuff? Okay. Last time we're looking at the piece Ghost and Minds, and the quick summary of that is, essentially we went through the question of assuming that a ghost is a mind that has been disembodied by death, but still is able to interact somehow causally with the physical world. What would the various, or some of the various philosophies of mind say about that possibility? And we saw the identity theory, where the person is the central nervous system. When that goes, the person's gone, so no ghosties. Then we saw with substance dualism, probably the best chance. You have two distinct metaphysical substances, the mind and the body, and they can presumably exist apart from each other. Then we looked at the property dualism, and we saw that one version of it, interactionism, does allow the possibility for post-death survival in ghosty form. And then we saw functionalism does allow for kind of an unusual form of ghost, but all ghosts are pretty unusual, so that's okay. Now we turn to the next major chunk of part 3, namely the metaphysical problem of universals. This is a really, really old problem in philosophy, going back to our good dead friends, Plato and Aristotle. Generically put, a universal is something that can be predicated of, to say attributed to many things. To use like an easy example, chair is a universal in the sense that it can be predicated to many objects. There's all kinds of chairs in the room. Also, things like shoes. Property being a shoe would be a universal because there's lots of shoes. Now, Plato and Aristotle thought that these universals were components of speech that enabled us to be able to talk about stuff like shoes and chairs, but also thought. So in order to think about stuff like shoes and chairs, we got to think about these universal things. Now, what they debated about, though, was the metaphysics behind that. When we say things like these are all chairs, or we say something like Caitlyn Jenner is a woman, or Bruce Jenner is a man, or was a man, then what are we talking about metaphysically? And this can be traced back even further to our good dead friend Thales. He's the guy we saw that, predicted the eclipse, and is credited in the West at least as coming up with science and philosophy. And as we saw, he was born around 624 BC, died 545. And he was looking at the ongoing problem of this. What is the unity that underlies the diversity of the world? Problem began with Thales, still going on today. People in physics who look for the grand unified theory, the totally unified theory, the awesome unified theory, which I think I just made up, but could be a thing, who knows. The idea is basically to find a principle that accounts for everything. Now, in the case of the problem of universals, as we saw before, the good dead from Plato, basically the challenge is this. The assumption is that reality, or at least our language, breaks down to two categories. One is the category of, categories, type. And a type is, of course, a class of things, like chair, or shoe, or kiwi, for the fruit and the verb, or man, or woman, or planet, or backpack, or water bottle, all those things, classes of things. And there's also what's called a token, in the sense that it's an individual. So there are types, classes of things, then there are individuals that fit in those classes. And so the problem of universals basically is this. In virtue of what does a particular individual, a token, fall under a type? So in virtue of what is, say, Garfield a cat? Or in virtue of what is that, this a computer case? In virtue of what is this a water bottle? And it tries to answer that question. Now, like all things philosophical, people divide into various and sundry camps. And the two big camps are, in this case, realism, and then the opposing viewpoint. Now, in normal everyday life, when people talk about being realist, or accepting realism, or being realistic, we usually think of that in terms of, concrete stuff. If someone says, I'm a realist, what they're probably saying is they don't deal in that abstract, weird stuff. They're all about, bread and butter, money, cash on the table, all about that practical stuff. Now, interestingly, boringly enough, this form of realism is about as far from that form of realism as you can be. Because again, sort of everyday realism, if someone says they're realistic, they say, I see things as they are. None of this abstract, theoretical stuff, just concrete things. Bricks and mortar, bread on the table, cash in the bank. Now, in this context, realism is this. If you're a realist about universals, you believe that universals are real, metaphysical entities, and they exist in reality, or beyond reality, or in the super real, as Plato said. So if someone were to ask, is chair a real thing? Not individual chairs, but the universal chair, and someone says, yes, I believe in chair, they would be a realist, because they believe in the metaphysical existence of that universal. Now, there's all kinds of different questions people raise about these things. Kind of question one is, are they real or not? And realists say, yeah, they're the realest real of all. Next question is, are they material objects or non-material? And the usual answer is they're not material, they're not physical things, typically. The third kind of question is, this is what divides Plato and Aristotle on one main point. There's the famous painting, The Society of Athens, and it shows Plato and Aristotle in the center, and Plato's pointing up, and Aristotle's kind of pointing down. And what that's about is, Plato, as we saw before, he puts his forms, his ideas, his universals in the Platonic heaven, whatever that is. So they're not only up, they're just not here. And Aristotle is claimed to have brought the universals to Earth. So they don't exist in like a Platonic heaven or hyperspace. They're here in the world. Now, some thinkers believe that they were here in the world. Other thinkers did not. And some of the folks divided up on this included John Scotus, St. Anselm, William of Champeaux, and some other dead guys. So part of the question is, are these things real? Realists say yeah. Do they exist here or in Platonic hyperspace? And they divide on that. People who believe they exist in Platonic hyperspace believe in what are called transcendent universals, because they're not here, they're somewhere not here. People that believe that they're here believe in what are called immanent universals, that they're here. So, weird stuff. Now, one of the major intellectual movements back in the past, and all these people are like super dead now, was called scholasticism. And we get our term, everyone's probably heard this, the term scholastics, which is another term for academics. Now, our good dead friend Charlemagne, Charles the Great, one of his lasting claims to enduring fame is he helped establish the university system that still exists in Europe to this day. Because universities, among their other functions, is when civilization collapses, if they survive, they keep civilization going. Probably happened to us too. When our civilization collapses, probably the great universities will survive in kind of a Mad Max style thing. Many of them will fail, but some will live on. And then 1,000 years hence, when civilization is rebuilt, they'll be rebuilding around universities. Yeah, because civilization always collapses, just a matter of time. So the scholastics, they were the folks who got these universities going, and like pretty much all things, they started off, pretty enthusiastic, creating all this new stuff, and they settled down basically to the status quo. And then, as we saw when we talked about our good dead friend Descartes, later thinkers came and revolted against them. It's kind of the history of human thought in politics. Thing comes in that's new, gets established, becomes the establishment, the status quo, gets rebelled against, get a new one. And repeat to infinity. Now the scholastics laid out the following formulation of the problem. And it came from this guy named Boethius, who translated Porphyry's Introduction to Aristotle's Categories. First question is, do they exist for real out there in the world, or are they just in your mind? Kind of important question. Second, are they, if they do exist for real, are they material or immaterial? Thirdly, if they are metaphysical, are they here or are they not? Platonic heaven type of deal. And since the time of these dead guys, people have been casting the problem kind of in the same way, in dividing up on those same lines. Now, as we saw, the folks who were realist believes that these universals are really real for real. A good question might be, so why do people believe crazy stuff like that? Well, basically there's, going way back to these dead guys, three main motivations for believing universals are really real for real. In terms of like non-crazy ones, like brain damage or something. First thing is the epistemic motivation, basically knowing stuff. Aristotle, our good dead friend, developed what we call categorical logic. If you take the critical thinking class or logic class, you'll probably get some categorical logic, which is of course logic about cats, or rather, categories. It's things like, all people are mortal, or all cats are mammals, that type of stuff. Now, since the logic about classes of things, the reasoning went, if we're going to reason about classes, like all cats being mammals, or all people being mortal, if that's going to be not make-believe, then we've got to have something underlying it to make it true that all the cats are mammals. And the answer they came up with was, well, you've got reality, and that corresponds to logic. So just as in our logical structure, all the cats are mammals, you've got a metaphysical structure. The cats have the universal mammon, or so it's claimed. So kind of first motivation is, in order for reasoning, logic, and language to work, you gotta have universals. Otherwise you're just making stuff up and none of this stuff would work. Or so they claim. Then they all died. Now what about the theological motivations? What are the religious motivations for the metaphysics? Now interestingly enough, in the Middle Ages, people used to get into knife fights over this issue, which is kind of unusual today, although there was, within the past couple of years, people got into a gunfight over Immanuel Kant. So I guess it still goes on today. They were only pellet guns though, not like a real gunfight. And it was in Russia. Now one theological motivation is this. You get the problem of original sin. Probably everyone knows, the basic story. You've got Adam and Eve hanging out in the Garden of Eden. Satan shows up and says, hey, look at that apple. I bet that's pretty tasty. And Eve takes the apple and says, wow, that's pretty tasty. Gives Adam a bite, and then pow, out of the Garden of Eden, and cursed with original sin. Now, people had a lot of time back then when they weren't, dying of the plague, because they didn't have Netflix and Hulu and video games and Xboxes and stuff. And so people who were smart and still alive did was wonder a lot about how that works. So how do you go from Adam and Eve and the serpent thing, how do we inherit that sin? How does the sin get passed on metaphysically? And they were worried about this. They wondered how would that work? What makes that happen? And here was their clever answer. In fact, a fellow named Odo, not to be confused with the Odo of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Odo Ternai, he came up with this clever idea. You've got the universal human, and of course, Adam and Eve both have that. They have that quality. And what he claimed happened, which is kind of an interesting claim, is that when sin occurred, that somehow the universal humanness got tainted, got kind of messed up and corrupted. And so, as humans, we all get the human universal, but it's got that sin kind of stuck on it. I'll use two crappy analogies to show how this, metaphorically, how this can be looked at. One way, to use a crappy metaphor, to think of the universals, you can kind of think of them as like a cookie cutter. And, because they, so to speak, stamp out all the stuff. So imagine, you're making cookies, and you've got a gingerbread cookie cutter, and it gets busted up. Gets, damaged. Now, if you use that cookie cutter, every cookie you make is going to have that defect, because it's built into the template. So going with that crappy analogy, if you think of the universal as like the cookie cutter, whenever you get the universal human, you're kind of punched out by the cookie cutter, you get that sin. Or if you want to use kind of a grosser metaphor, there could be something nasty on the cookie cutter. So every time you cut a cookie, it gets on there, maybe some saliva or some something awful. Now a second crappy analogy, we can use genetics. We can think of it kind of like the genes, double helix thing going on, and we know those get passed on. So using the crappy metaphor, imagine the gene you get some genetic damage, so you get a genetic defect in there, and of course that gets passed on. If you're that gene that makes you human and it's got a defect in it, you get that defect, metaphorically speaking. So good old Odo thought, that's all the problem. How does sin get passed down through all the generations? Well, you get the universal human, it gets tainted with the sin, and so every human inherits that particular corruption. So we all get that sin. Not everyone bought that, of course, but it's one primary motivation for metaphysical universals, to explain sin. Because otherwise, if you believe in the story of the Garden of Eden, we weren't there, we didn't eat the apple, we didn't do anything wrong. And so you have to have some justification why we keep getting, cursed with the sin, even though we didn't do anything ourselves. And that's one way to do it. You just stuck on there, you get to be human, you get all that nasty sin. Second motivation is this. Trinity. Not all versions of Christianity accept this, but some do. the idea that, you know, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But of course, Christianity is monotheistic. There's but one God, and you know, Ten Commandments says, you know, no God, you know, ahead of that God. Now then you end up with a problem, because if you got, you know, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, you get three things, and three is not one. The three would be polytheism, that's heresy. So how do you make three into one? Well, universals to the rescue. What happens basically is this. If you have the universal essence of God, universals have the cool property that they can be in many places at the same time. I mean, here's the example of chair. The chairs are all over the room. So chair's there, chair's here, chair's there. So chair is here, there, and everywhere. So you make God universal, then God can be three places at once. It's still just God, but he can be, you know, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. So one being in three roles, three places. To use like another to use a really crappy analogy, you can imagine like these being like roles. And this is like being a person. As a person, you can have three different roles. A person could be the father of their kids, and the son of their parents, and then have some other job, like you know, volleyball coach, for example. So the metaphysical universals are pretty important. So provide one way to provide the basis for original sin, and also handling the Trinity, how three can be one without falling into either saying, you know, there is no Trinity, or the heresy of saying that there's actually three gods, which some people did, and they were presumably burned alive for such beliefs, or stoned to death, or drowned, or something. Now, even though universals got all that cool stuff going for them, one problem that came up was this. And our good dead friend, John Scotus Regina, saw this problem, but many thinkers didn't. But here's one of the classic problems. One thing we get, of course, is we know that there are like classes of things. For example, we're humans, but we also fall under the category, a broader category. We fall under primates, we fall under mammals, we fall under animals, and we fall under beings, you know, roughly put. And if the idea is that if you're in a class, you're like that thing, you end up with a bit of a problem, namely this. If we fall under, you know, primate, mammal, animal, and being, and we make being, some thinkers did, equal to God, then it ends up being that we're all part of God. We end up in that pantheism mentioned before. Everything is God. Now, some thinkers didn't realize the implications. I mean, it's a common mistake people make. They don't realize what their views entail, especially when they're like horrible things. But John Scotus seemed to have seen this, that if you accept this sort of thing, you end up with pantheism. Everything is God. And that's considered by some to be heresy. Brothers like our good dead friend Spinoza think that was pretty cool. Okay, so one of the camps is realism. You're a realist if you believe in universals for real. They have metaphysical reality. And of course that seems really weird, because then you got to believe in things like chairness and horseness and peopleness. And even in the time of Socrates, there's a dialogue where someone says to Socrates, Socrates, I see the horse, but I don't see the horseness. They could say, I can see the chair, but I don't see the chairness. So one of the main camps is realism about universals, which is super weird. Now, the main opposing camp, and usually just like with politics and a lot of stuff, usually you got two sides. I mean, it breaks down even more, you know, to kind of factions, but one faction are the realists. Second faction are called the nominalists. It comes from nomina, meaning name. You might have heard, like in English class, people talking about the nom de plume, you know, name of the pen. It's basically a name you write under when you'd rather not have people know that you're writing such stuff, which some people do to avoid the shame of their they're bad writing. Now, as a philosophical view, here's the idea. If you're a nominalist, you believe universal in the sense, like an anomalist says, you ask an anomalist, are there chairs? They say, yep, chairs. Are there horses? Yep, horses. Where they differ is this. If you ask them, in virtue of what is that chair or chair, they would say a chair is a chair or a horse is a horse because we call it that. You naming the thing, that's how you categorize it. So what all chairs have in common, we call them chairs. What all horses have in common, we call them horses. Now, people liked nominalism because it seemed less crazy. Because realism, you had to say, there are these metaphysical entities, there's chairness, which sounds kind of crazy. You'd say like the room, it's got chairs and chairness and horseness and all this stuff. Sounds kind of mad. And nominalism seems kind of reasonable. What all these chairs have in common, we call them chairs. That's it. No crazy metaphysical stuff. One of the thinkers who liked the nominalism stuff was a fellow named Labossiere, 1050 to 1120. Still lived today. He was labeled a heretic for his view. Here's why. He accepted nominalism. He said that all that there is particulars. There are no universals. There's just individuals. There's no categories. Categories are just names. And he had the phrase flatus and vocis, basically vocal sounds. So if you ask, Labossiere, before he was, dead, what all chairs in common, he'd say the name. We call them chairs. Now, why did he get labeled a heretic? Well, because of this. If you reject universals, then the Trinity becomes a mere name. There's really no Trinity. There can't be three that's one because they're just individuals. There's no universals, and so there's three beings, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And that's heresy. That's punishable by all kinds of death stuff. And so he quickly recanted his nominalism. Now, there are of course some problems in nominalism. One is this. Although it's kind of appealing, we think there's more to like being a chair than just calling it a chair. How so? Well, it's pretty easy in a way to test kind of intuitively because even though we call chairs chairs, we seem to sort of resist just allowing anything to be a chair. Because if it's just a name, I could say, okay, chair, that's chair, that's chair. This is chair, this is chair, this is chair now, that's chair, that chair, that's chair, that's chair, that's chair, that's chair, all chair. And of course that seems equally crazy. That is, we think on one hand, yeah, we call them all chairs, but we think there's, it's like the, what's it, Sesame Street, where they blew the game like one of these things doesn't belong. In this case we have a lot of things that doesn't belong. If we had all the chairs, we'd say, yeah, we get some stuff in common. But the chairs in like the water bottle, well, we really can't call that chair. And so one thing is common sense seems to say things have to have stuff in common for us to group them together. That we just can't arbitrarily just group things and say, okay, these are all chairs. The second thing, of course, was theology. In order for original sin to work, you got to have some means of passing that sin down. And universals seem to do it. And of course, there's a problem of the Trinity. Now, one area where, a lot of this, of course, again, is sort of metaphysical stuff, ties into things like, logic and language and religion, pretty abstract stuff that most people really don't care too much about. But it does have some interesting implications in things that are like heating up, or were heating up, the internets and the Twitters. Namely, think of a concrete example. Think about this. We had, of course, the famous case, everyone was talking about the Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner thing. And one issue that actually connects to nominalism versus universals is the issue of gender. Now, gender, of course, is tricky because we also use the term, biological sex. And that, of course, is a matter of anatomy, plumbing. and also genetics, which may or may not be the same. Now, people would tend to think that anatomy is like a real thing, that although with surgery you can change your anatomy, the anatomy is not just a name of things. Like a person just can't, have a certain sort of plumbing and say, I call myself, email. And they could do that, but people would say, well, you gotta have the plumbing there. So this could be kind of like looked at like realism. It's a feature of reality what anatomy a person has and what their genes are. It's not the name of the thing, it's the parts. Now, but then when you get to gender, then it becomes a bit trickier. Some people say, well, the gender is just the anatomy, just the plumbing, and the or the genetics. But thanks to Caitlin Jenner and others, there's now the view that, and also going back before them, the view that gender is more of like a social construct. That a person has their anatomy and genetics is not a social construct. It's just a matter of biological reality. But a person's gender choice, like a person can choose to be labeled as male or man or woman or other genders. I think Facebook has like 50 genders. We'll keep it simple. We don't go to those 50. Now, one way to approach this is to be what we could call a gender nominalist. That all there is to gender is being named that. So a person, then the question comes, can a person just like name their own gender? The person just decides themselves what their gender is going to be. Or is it something they have to kind of get other people to agree to? And one way to kind of look at that is like, naming stuff. If we want to call chairs chairs, we want people to know what we mean, we've got to kind of go along with other people. So if I wanted to call, this chair, to make any sense to other people, I have to get other people to cooperate. And the gender thing is a similar issue. If someone wants to say they're a woman, does that require the cooperation of other people to go along with it? Or can people just sort of declare themselves to have that? And again, this is where the idea of universals and nominalism actually connects to, well, the internet's at least. So that provides an interesting case. Is gender a case of nominalism? You just name it. You just decide you're going to be, call yourself a particular gender. Does it require, social cooperation? Or is there actually a metaphysical foundation? I mean, there are people who are, believe that it does. It grounds in, the reality. You just can't, change your gender by changing the name. But anyways, that's an example of stuff going on today. Before pressing on, anything about that stuff that needs more? Now, in addition to realism and nominalism, sometimes called anti-realism, there's a third path that is realistic, but avoids the, at least in my opinion, in my biased opinion, the craziness of realism about universals. It's sometimes called conceptualism, sometimes called abstract particularism, and sometimes called trope theory. Which is kind of a bad choice because we already have a use for tropes in like literature and film. But here we go. There was a fellow named Peter Abelard. It sounds like a limerick, but I got nothing on that. He was born in 1079, died in 1142, still very dead today. He was a student of Rosellin and also of William of Champeau. He thought that both realism and nominalism were mistaken. And here's how he argued against realism. One problem was this. If you take that whole, universals, can categorize other universals, you end up with, humans, and we'll say donkeys, badly drawn donkeys. They both fall under the universal animal. But humans are sometimes rational, and donkeys are irrational. They don't have reason. Therefore, Abelard pointed out, the universal of animal is both rational and irrational, which seems inconsistent. So that seems kind of problematic, kind of crazy. And there's ways around that, but that's a spiritual. Problem 2. This is probably the most serious, problem. This goes back to our methodology. If you can show that metaphysical theory has got crazy weirdness going on, that's a mark against it. And here's the crazy weirdness of universal theory. Now, the hallmark of a universal is this. A universal can exist entirely, wholly, in different locations at different times. Now, it makes perfect sense for something to be able to exist in different places, like in pieces. Like, imagine, take this, in a sense, the expo marker is in like two places because I've, taken it apart. Or I could break it in a whole bunch of pieces and scatter them. And that makes sense. You break something up, it can exist in pieces in different places, like a puzzle. But the universal, the claim is, its entirety, its wholeness, could be in one place, and another place, all at the same time. And that's called, for obvious reasons, multiple location. And of course that seems crazy because, well, let me put it as a question. Suppose I were to claim that I'm here now, entirely in Tallahassee, Florida, but I say at the same time, I'm also in Bangor, Maine, and I'm also in Utah. Well, if I said such things, you'd assume that either I didn't understand what I was saying, or I was crazy. Because although there could be like bits of me in places, I could be missing some parts, if I'm entirely here, I can't be entirely there. Or to use another crappy analogy, if I say all my keys are in my pocket, and I say, well, I got some other keys somewhere else, you'd say you don't understand what all means, because all means it's there and it's nowhere else. And so universal is supposed to have that quality. So every chair in the room, chair is entirely there, which seems crazy. So Abelard pointed out and said, that's crazy talk. Multiplication is insane and impossible. And I totally agree with Abelard. As I said, my biased view is I think universals are totally crazy. He also realized that it led to pantheism, which were regarded as heresy, which is super bad. So, problems for realism. Now, there's still, of course, a problem of, even if you reject universals and realism, we still have to deal with, like, words and logic. And what Abelard came up with was this. The notion of universal words. They point to universal concepts. And the concepts are words, logical, content, or meaning. Now what he tried to do here was kind of a cheat, which is later grabbed on by others who try to cheat as well. And the claim is that instead of having like a universal exist in the same place everywhere, because that's crazy, he came up with this notion of having a concept, that we have a common but confused image. To be a little clearer, take like our concept of cat. And the question is, how is it, do we recognize, all the cats? And we're pretty good at that. We're really good at like cat sorting. If you gave people like a room full of critters, they'd be pretty good at picking up the cats and separating them from all other critters as well. We're good at that kind of stuff. And a good question is, how do we do that? And what people at Google and so forth are working on is figuring out how we do that, or how that's done. Maybe not how we do it, but how it's done, so you can sort stuff really well. If you use Google, I think, Photo, they split it off from Google Plus, because no one was using Google Plus because it was awful. But if you have the Google Photos now, they offer one sort of perk they offer you as an assistant that's supposed to sort all your photos for you. It claims to be able to recognize what the pictures are of and organize your collections. So if you do a lot of photography, which most people do because everyone's got a smartphone with a camera, it purports, it also is free storage, not to like, I guess Google should give me something for this, but I guess they give me free storage like everybody. But supposedly it'll sort your stuff out. And so Google is trying to address that problem. How is it that we sort things, like how can you take all your pictures of like cats and put them into like the cat category? Or all pictures of like, your friends and put them in the friend category. And so the challenge is, how do we work that out? Well, what Abelard claimed is that we have kind of a confused common image. I'll draw it out awfully. So instead of like a particular cat, we've got like blurry cat as opposed to grumpy cat. And blurry cat stands in for all cats. So it's like the picture we've got, a confused and common picture that stands for all cats. It's like our cat icon. Now, of course, it's got to be confused because if it's a unconfused image of a cat, then it'd be a picture not of like all cat, but it'd just be of that cat. It'd be like a picture of Grumpy Cat, or Morris, or Garfield, or Bill. Now, that of course answer is not super satisfying, because if you just get like a confused and common image, there's still a question of how does that work? How does that stand in for all cats? And critics have said, you know, raise that point. Now, Abelard seemed to be on the path towards a more robust view, what is called, well, he sort of wiggles between moderate nominalism and moderate realism. Here's the idea. One way to be a moderate nominalist is to say, okay, there aren't any like weird metaphysical universals, but there's more to like organizing stuff than just naming stuff. So in this sort of view, he accepts we have general concepts in the mind that are mental constructs. If anyone has ever done like any, you know, social theory or social identity theory, you might have heard of like how things are like socially constructed. For example, going back to the gender thing, some theorists claim that gender is a social construct. Biological sex is biology, that's, you know, physiology, anatomy, genetics, but gender roles are social constructs, we make that up. Similarly, like a person's position like in a social organization, like being vice president or being like a teaching assistant, those are social constructs, we make that stuff up. And so what Abelard's kind of considering is we maybe have these concepts in our mind that organize stuff. It's not out there, it's in the mind. But then he kind of slides towards modern realism, because I think in a way he's, you know, exposing sort of the problems of the views and the problems of one kind of push a person like one way, they kind of push the person the other. So what he comes up with is another sheet, which is this. He comes with the idea of abstraction, that there's an objective basis for categorizing stuff. So when we sort chairs into chairs, males, females, kiwis, you know, the birds, the fruit, that we're not just like making crap up, but he claims they don't exist apart. And he comes up with a clever cheat called a distinction in reason. And that's a way of saying there's a difference, but there's not. Which I've always thought, I mean, some people think this is a fair move. I'm being unfair, because I say it's a cheat. Other people say it's perfectly reasonable to say there's a distinction in reason. And my response has always been, well, if there's no difference, what is the difference? Like, it's in reason. Like, what does that mean? That's what he claims. That the qualities are out there, but they're not really separate. We're just mentally kind of separating them out. Which again I think is problematic, but other people think that it's pretty cool. So he presents this as an alternative to realism. So he's kind of sliding away from the problems of nominalism and realism to conceptualism. Now, this points the way to what I think is actually the correct view. Mainly because I wrote my dissertation on this, so I think it's right. But I'm probably totally wrong. Because generally I found the more I believe in something, usually the more likely it is that I'm incorrect. So this includes people like Abelard, Aquinas, more recently Keith Campbell, I think he's still alive, and me actually, but I'm still alive. Yep, still going. Not dead yet. So kind of the slide is this. For Abelard and Aquinas kind of sliding towards realism, can't resist that Kool-Aid, they end up with the following view. And this is also kind of jury-rigged as well. But if it's correct, it's okay. And here's what they did. They said, okay, here's how we make this work. We have universals existing ante rem, which is fancy Latin for before things. So we got God. And I'll use a crappy example of cat, or in Spanish, gato. So okay, the cat, or some kind of animal, hopefully God's idea of cat is better than that. But if God with this concept of cat, to use a crap analogy, he's got like the blueprint, you know, the cat print. And then of course what God does is God creates the cats. And so universals here exist in REM, in things, as properties that group through resemblance. So what do all the cats have in common? Well, they're built by God. So all the cats are, to use the crap analogy, constructed on God's blueprints. Or to use maybe a less crappy analogy, it's like God is like a super genetic engineer. He comes up with the genetic code for cat, thinks it up, well instantly because he's God, and then pow, let there be cats. And then you get the cats, and they have in them genetic code for cats, the cat code. Kind of like the Da Vinci Code, but with cats. And so then how do we categorize and sort this stuff out? Well, then what happens according to these dead guys, we see the cats. See the cats on the internet, see the Murphy cat, see the Morris the cat, see Felix the cat, see all those cats. And what we're able to do is form this universal post-REM after things as mental concepts. So we form in our mind a kind of less awesome idea of cat. Crudely put, God is the gene code for cats. Let there be cats, there are cats. They have the gene code that makes them cats. We observe cats, and now of course we can sequence their genetic code, and then we get that idea. So we say, aha, all these cats are cats because they have that gene code, and that's kind of like the universal. All things with that code are cats, and because they're built on God's master cat plan. So there's no universals in the weird metaphysical sense. Everything's a particular. You got God, he's got his cat code, genetic code, they're all his integral cats, they've all got the cat code. When you see the cat, you get the idea of cat, problem solved. No crazy universals, just a lot of cats. Now, later thinkers went on to create what's called trope theory, which is a crappy name, but they still won't change it. And again, the reason why it's a crappy name, because if you're familiar, if you have a class like in lit or film, they talk about like tropes in film and literature. So, bad choice. Sometimes they call them abstract particulars, which is also a crappy name. And so we're stuck with a crappy name for the theory. I have some other cool suggestions, but no one accepts those. Maybe someday. The dream lives on. So those are some of the crazy views about universals. Now, if there's anything crazier than universals, that would be universals with time travel. So if we're traveling in time, anything about the universal stuff, it needs more stuff. Okay, so all these dead folks and some living folks trying to figure out how do we categorize stuff, how do we group stuff together. Some people are realists, they say there's really real categories. And some say these are metaphysical entities that can exist in different places at the same time. Other people say that's crazy, it's all just language. We name things and make them fall into categories. And then of course the sensible folks believe in those trope things, which are properties that resemble. Okay, so now we turn to looking at universals and time travel in the essay Meeting Yourself. Now, we're all familiar with travel. We're probably most familiar with spatial travel, which is moving from one point in space to another point in space, like from here over to here. Now, in normal travel, you could begin at a point here on the Earth and travel all around the Earth and come back here. But of course, in normal spatial travel, no matter how fast you go, you can never catch yourself. Because no matter where you go, there you are. But time travel is also a form of travel. Moving around, as they say probably incorrectly, in the fourth dimension. And right now, we're all traveling in time. We're all time travelers. We're traveling forward in time at the rate of 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour, 24 hours per day, 365 and a quarter days per year. Right now, you're moving in time towards the future. Now, in our normal way of time travel, we're heading towards from the past to the future through the now, but it's always now. That's why when people say what time is it, the correct answer is always now, because that is always true. It is always now. Never tomorrow, never yesterday, always now. Now, one interesting thing about time travel is, unlike spatial travel, no matter how fast you go, you can't meet yourself. With time travel, you could. All you got to do is travel back in time to where you were. You can do that. You can travel back like a minute. There you are from a minute ago. Or you can travel ahead in time, as long as you time it so you don't miss, you don't jump your death date. You can meet yourself. Now, this possibility of going back in time and meeting yourself or going forward in the future does create, of course, all kinds of classic problems and paradoxes for time travel. Many of which, and most of which, were developed in science fiction or developed in, philosophy or science, and then later applied in science fiction. One of the most famous ones is what's called the grandfather paradox, which is this. Suppose time travel is possible. To the past. Now that would mean that a person could travel from now back to then. And if you had someone, for whatever reason, they wanted to travel back in time to kill their grandfather. Now we can make it like they're not like, psychotic or something. They might accidentally kill their grandfather. They put back in time, they're trying to show their grandfather their time machine and like pops in on them, crushes them. Now of course this is where the paradox arises. If someone goes back in time and shoots their grandfather, they would of course not exist. And if they didn't exist, they couldn't come back in time to shoot their grandfather. But of course if they don't go back and shoot their grandfather exists, so they do. So they could go back in time and shoot their grandfather, but if they did, they would cease to exist, so they couldn't do it. And that of course is a crazy paradox. As I mentioned, people like the time travel problems in TV science fiction. If anybody watches CW's The Flash, they have, the guy Reverse Flash from the future, and of course, well, this is kind of a spoiler, but one of the characters in the time is the ancestor of the Reverse Flash, and his solution to the problem is he just shoots himself. Pow. And of course what happens is, if the ancestor goes, the person goes. But then of course you end up with that paradox that if the person shoots himself, the ancestor comes back, you don't have all those problems, so you end up with those messes. Which is why it's generally best not to try to include time travel, because it never makes any sense. It's cool, but it never makes any sense. So that's kind of one of the paradoxes of time travel. There's all kinds of other problems as well. Now, fortunately, in this essay, I'm not addressing that particular problem. Because, I don't mention this in the essay, but one that people will come up with as a potential solution is this. You may wonder, well, how do we handle that? One answer given by some physicists is that, well, if you go back in time, you cannot succeed. Because you are there, so you could not succeed in killing your grandfather. No matter what you try to do, you'll always fail. So you can go back and see your grandfather, but no matter what you do, you don't risk, killing them. Now, a second thing people come up with is that if you go back in time, you're not really traveling in time. You're going to a parallel or alternate dimension. And so when you do something there, you change that world's timeline. So you can't kill your own grandfather, you can only go back and kill a parallel grandfather. And so that world would be different. And that also makes for some good science fiction too. Or not. Now, again, fortunately, we don't have to deal with those particular problems, so we can leave those unsolved, because they're probably unsolvable. Now, we're talking about universals, so the question would be, what does this get to do with universals? Well, as we saw, one of the biggest problems for universals is multiple location. How is it the same thing can be entirely in different places at the same time? And that's weird and mysterious. Now, the problem with universals we saw just a bit ago is, of course, in virtue of what is a particular of a type. In virtue of what is that chair, a chair. In virtue of what is Morris, a cat. All the stuff we saw before. And universals seem to solve the time travel problem this way. Universals, as you recall, can exist wholly at different places at the same time. So it would seem that universals can make time travel possible. How so? Well, here's kind of the problem, or here's how it solves the problem. Suppose this is you right now, and after you graduate, you go on to decide to switch your career paths, and you go into temporal research. And in 2050, you build the world's first functioning time machine. And you print out a copy of all the winning lottery numbers and all the Super Bowl results, and load them in your time machine, pop back to today, give them to yourself. Now, of course, in order for that to occur, you, from 2050, have to be in the same room as yourself. In other words, you have to be multiply located. You have to be like here, and also, say, waiting, hey, time traveler, right out there, waiting outside the door to, find your past self, and give yourself all those, lottery ticket numbers, etc. Now, of course, that creates a bit of a problem because normally you can't be in two places at the same time. But universals make that happen. How so? Well, that's exactly what universals do. They can exist entirely at two places at the same time, so it seems that time travel becomes possible with universals. So, you of 2015 could be 10 feet away from you from 2050, because if everything that makes you up is universals, they can do that, because they're special and weird. So, seemingly problem solving. Because time travel, basically the heart requires multiple location. You get at the same thing, be able to be a certain distance from itself at the same time. Now, since universals are insane, but time travel is cool, well, one of the challenges, of course, how do you get rid of those crazy universals but keep time travel? Well, the answer is, of course, tropes. Now, here's the difference between the crazy trope theorist and the crazy universal theorist. Here's the idea. I'll use the boring example of a bag of marbles. Or we can just use circles. Yeah, I'll use circles. Suppose you got 6 circles. If you were in their, white circles because they're on a whiteboard. So if you believe the universals, you would say there were 7 things here. There would be 6 circles and 1 universal white. And it'd be the same white in each case. You could use a bag of marbles too. You could have a bag of marbles that are green, you'd have 7 things. 6 marbles, universal green. Because the same thing, multiply located. Now the trope theorist says, that's crazy. Let me give you something that's also crazy but slightly different. What the trope theorists would say is this. They would say you got 6 circles, you also have 6 different whites. There's not one white that they all somehow instantiate, so there'd be, in this case, 12 things. 6 circles, 6, white qualities. And those particular, qualities would be called tropes, so they claim. Now, if you believe in universals, and you ask, in virtue of what? Are all 6 circles white circles? The answer is, they got the universal white. That makes them all white. The same with the circle. The universal circle that makes them all circles. But the trope theorist can't say that, because it's all going to be particulars. So the trope theorist would say, you got 6 circles, 6 white circles. Each one, they're not identical, but they resemble. So instead of identity, where the circles are all identical in their color, they're really, really close. So the trope theorist says, not identity, but resemblance. So you can have things that are very much alike in different places at the same time. I mean, we can use the example of the chairs. All these chairs are very much alike, but they're not identical. So they can all be in different places at different times. No problem. So that seems a little less crazy than universals, which are totally crazy. Now, but then you end up in a bit of a problem, which is this. Namely, that time travel is cool. And generally, as a rule, you want to maximize the number of cool things in reality. And time travel is pretty cool, so we want to have that. It's cool. So how to make that happen? Well, the problem would be this. If we don't believe in universals, then we end up with the following scenario. Here's you from 2050, the inventor of the first functional time machine. Here's you 2015. But for you to go back, you have to go back. And you have to be, you know, say 10 feet from yourself, the same being 10 feet apart. But of course, if all there are tropes, that cannot be. So time travel would be impossible because you cannot be 10 feet from yourself. You can't have multiple locations. Now, one option would be to say, yeah, time travel is cool, but universals are just too crazy. So we'll go with our tropes and just say we'll leave time travel to science fiction. See, it's just not possible. But fortunately, since time travel is cool and universals are crazy, here's how you can make. Here's how you can fix the problem. Here's the fix. Everyone's heard of the dead guy Einstein, bad hair. He also had a brilliant idea. He bought like 7 copies of exactly the same clothing. That's why if you see a picture of Einstein, he's pretty much always wearing the same clothing. I mean, it's not that he didn't, you know, just wore the same, literally the same shirt every day. He just had like 7 shirts that looked the same. And his reasoning was, why spend mental effort on things that don't matter, like, you know, picking out your clothing? That way you always know what to wear. You always have the same clothing, which is, I think it's kind of smart. Now, one of the things he came up with was this notion of relativity. And there's all kinds of interesting implications for relativity. They do all kinds of cool stuff with like GPS, quantum computing, and all that neat, neat stuff. But here's how it helps out with the problem at hand. One of the implications of the theory of relativity, and not surprisingly, is that space and time is relative. That, and we'll focus on time. There is no such thing, at least according to relativity, as universal time. So all our times are different. Not in the sense of that our watches may be a little off, but that literally time, whatever it is not a universal thing. Now, people often kind of think of like time as like a box that we're all kind of in, like in this big box of time, like we're in a big box of space. But Einstein's view is that each entity, and this is grossly oversimplified because, you know, I'm not Einstein, that each thing has its own sort of time. Now, to illustrate this and to show that this is true, well, people wondered, like, okay, Einstein says, you know, there's no universal time. How can we test this? How do we prove that? And this is the idea they came up with is pretty clever. One of the aspects of the theory is that, weirdly, the faster something goes, the closer it approaches the speed of light, the slower its time goes, relative to other things. Now, also, gravity affects time as well. And so what they hit on was the following idea. You take 2 precision atomic clocks, and you sync them. So, you know, tick, 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 synchronized clocks. You load one on the space shuttle, back when we had a space shuttle, and you shoot it off into space, because that changes the gravity, and of course the shuttle is going pretty fast. And then the shuttle comes and lands, and you compare the clocks. And lo and behold, they found out that there was, the reason why they use precision atomic clocks is because they can measure, you know, time, although that's kind of inaccurate. But we'll just use that normal system. They can measure time very exactly. And they found that there is actually a difference. Now, one interesting and boring thing this leads to is what's called the twins problem. And here's how that works. Nothing really to do with this particular thing, but kind of an interesting point. As I mentioned, the faster things go, the slower their time goes relative to something else. And the usual example they give is this. Imagine you've got 2 twins. space twin and Earth twin. And one of them becomes like a lawyer, and one becomes like an astronaut. And the astronaut goes on a ship that goes really fast. Let's say 70% light speed. And so, pow, they're off to Alpha Centauri. Now, what will happen is the faster the ship goes, for the twin in the ship, everything will seem perfectly normal. Like, suppose you're the twin, you're a space twin, and you're in the ship. As far as you can tell, your watch works the same way. It won't seem super slow because you'll be going, from your perspective, your normal speed. So from your standpoint, nothing will be different. But when you come back to Earth, several years later, what would happen is this. You would have aged slower because your time would be slower than your twin. Now, if somehow you're able to have like an outside view like God would see it, the person you, space twin, you would seem to be moving slower relative to Earth twin. Now, we can't, as of yet, go fast enough to really notice that difference. So, for example, they have actually two twin astronauts. One, is up in the International Space Station. One's here on Earth, and now they're doing to compare the effects of weightlessness, etc. Not doing the high speed thing, but it's something we in theory could test. But we need something really, really fast. One final thing about that, and nothing to do with this directly, is one of the problems we face is other planets that are habitable, if there are any, are really far away. Our nearest neighbor is about 4 light years away. So it would take 4 years of travel at the speed of light to get there. And we go really, really slow. But one thing I think might help is this. If going faster slows your time down, then if the time dilation effect really works for real, the journey would take 4 years from the standpoint or perspective from Earth, but may take less. So if you're the space twin piloting the ship, then it would be like less time for you, supposedly. So we may be able to have some possible solution to the problem that as time slows down, you would live long enough to be alive when the ship arrives. Maybe. And of course there are other solutions. There's like in sci-fi, where they use hibernation, and of course there's a Star Trek solution, warp drive, which is way cooler than just tooling around at the speed of light. Now getting back to our main problem, here's a solution. If relativity is correct, there is no same time. And that's good for 2 reasons. One, it seems to destroy universals, and they're crazy, so that's good. And it seems to allow time travel and tropes. And here's how it plays out. Right now, if Einstein is right, our times are not exactly in sync. I mean, yeah, we got our watches, and we can say, it's 2:29, blah, blah, blah. But the gravitation is probably microscopically different here. Interesting enough, boring enough, they found that gravity actually does vary around the Earth. You wouldn't notice, it wasn't like you step along, high gravity, but it does vary. Also, of course, I'm moving it, slightly faster now, so my time changes a bit. But of course we don't notice it because the difference between my time and your time is astronomically short. It's virtually unnoticeable. Well, actually it's completely unnoticeable to us. So, since there's no sameness of time, something cannot be in 2 places at the same time because there is no same time. So take that, universals. Now, people who like universals believe they have a way around that. I think they're wrong, they think they're right, but of course they're wrong. They have good arguments as to why I'm totally wrong. Now, if we accept that, the no 2 things at the same time, the you from 2050 could travel back in time. And of course you wouldn't be at the same time as yourself because nothing is at the same time. So you could give yourself that list of winning lottery numbers and Super Bowl winners and be set. That way you could fund maybe that's how you fund your time travel research. Winning all those lotteries and breaking all those Super Bowls, then you can get the time machine and able to go back in time. Or to save trouble, the person could just give you the plans of the time machine, that way you're already to the building, once you get your Kickstarter for time machines going. So it would seem that we're able to save tropes, time travel, and get rid of those darn crazy universals, making the world a better place. today, tomorrow, and forever. Okay, before moving away from universals to our last bit, namely a bit of Taoism, led to the East for some Tao, anything about time travel or tropes, universals that needs more stuff? Now, Taoism is one of the three main modes of thought in China. Well, actually, there's like 40. There's, of course, there's Taoism, there's Confucianism, and of course there's also kind of pseudo-communism, which is now more like capitalism. Because every society has a view that money is great. So every society's got that pyramid thing. Now, the author of the work Tao Te Ching, basically it's about the Tao, and the author of the book is a guy, well, supposedly a guy named Laozi. And what this translates as is Zhu, means like master or wise person, in like a sense like a martial arts master, for example, like Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan. And Lao means like old, so it really kind of means like wise old man. You might have heard, if you do any Eastern stuff, you might have heard of a guy named Sun Tzu. He wrote a famous book called The Art of War. Pretty good book, well worth reading, but he's master son. Now, we don't know if Lao Tzu like really existed. In many ways, he's kind of like Homer, in that, you know, there's a famous work, you know, basically the Way of the Tao, and it's attributed to a guy named Lao Tzu, and supposedly he met Confucius at some point, but we're not entirely certain that there actually was a guy named Lao Tzu who wrote this work. Could there be? Sure, it's a good story, and sometimes a good story is better than the truth. So we can, I guess, accept that he did exist, because it's cooler that way. Now, the thing about the writings of the Taoists, unlike our good dead friends like Aquinas and Aristotle argue over every single point, Eastern philosophy, at least sort of classical Eastern philosophy like Taoism and Confucianism, tends to not place so much emphasis on arguing all the points. Arguing every darn thing is more of a Greek thing. Argue everything. Arguments backing up stuff. In Eastern thought, there is some argumentation, but mostly it's kind of an argument by intuition, in the sense that if it sounds appealing and plausible, you should accept it. And in many ways, if you're just like reading or trying to read for enjoyment, Eastern thought is often much more enjoyable to read, because it's not argument. In many ways, it often tends to be somewhat well written. Now, Taoism in some ways is both a philosophy, in a sense, it's an attempt to explain the nature of reality, but it's also regarded by many as a religion. So if you take a class on world religions or Eastern world religions, they will list Taoism as a religion. But not all Taoists accept Taoism as a religion. They might regard it more as a philosophy. Because as we'll see, although Taoism seems to certainly have like metaphysical entities, namely the Tao does not appear to be a god. It's not, in Taoism, at least in the classic version, it's not actually, doesn't seem to be worshipped. Doesn't seem to be like a person in the classic sense. And so there is that interesting, question: how do you distinguish between a religion and, say, a philosophical view of life? And it gets kind of blurry, which is appropriate. Now, instead of just sort of grinding through every single piece, what you can do is, if you'd like, read through the Taoism a bit, and I'll just say a bit about some of the in our remaining time, some of the sort of the main points of the Taoist excerpt. Now, one thing about it is, its origin is mysterious. It is not known where it originated. In terms of its name, well, it's called the Tao, but of course it has other names, and as we saw kind of with Nagasena, the name of the thing, is inadequate. Which is, a fairly common view when you're dealing with sort of like ultimate entities. We have to name them because we need words to point to them, but usually the idea is that the name is just a pointing towards it. It fails to capture. Of course, that's true of everything. We all have names, but our name is not our full story. It doesn't tell others who we are, or tell us who we are. It is our label. Now, one interesting thing about Taoism, among many, is this similarity that's taken to water, kind of metaphor or story of water. And it sort of defines the Taoist outlook and the way of doing. There's a phrase in Chinese called wei wu wei, to do without doing. Now, it's not like doing stuff like literally without doing anything, like a person that sits there and it's magically done. The idea is, usually interpreted, is doing things with the way of minimal effort, but not in the sense of sort of like, well, to use a crude phrase, not half-assing it, but getting things done properly without excessive effort. In other words, you get it done, but you don't waste energy or effort doing so. So non-wasteful. And water, of course, works like that. And everyone's familiar with water. When water runs downhill, water always runs downhill. It doesn't, I mean, it has no choice, but the metaphor is, it always takes the easiest path. Why, take the difficult way if there's no advantage to it? And of course, when water hits an obstacle, it doesn't, if there's a way around, it doesn't bash itself against that obstacle, it just goes around it. Now, of course, you'd say like, the water will wear through things, et cetera, et cetera. But again, we're being, metaphorical, sort of like parables style stories. And so one of the ideas there basically is an outlook on life. When going through life, why bash yourself against things, obstacles, when you can simply work around them or bypass them? Now again, they're not saying, half-ass your way through life and just, take the easy way and don't accomplish anything. But the view is why be stupid? If there's a wall, why bash your head against the wall, try to break through it, when there is a door? If there's an obstacle in your path, and you can simply go around it, why bash yourself against it to no advantage? Now this also applies not just to doing things in life. So the question would be, okay, I wish to accomplish this, and there's a really hard way that will just, destroy me, or I can just sort of bypass that horrible, nightmarish mess. And the Taoist approach would be, why go into the horrible, nightmarish mess when you can avoid that horrible nightmare? Again, they're not saying cut corners, half-ass it, etc. The idea is basically, why beat your head against the wall when it's going to do nothing? Now, of course, you can also apply it to dealing with people. Everyone, I assume, has dealt with people. And one thing I found about people is every person has at least one crazy thing. That if you hit that crazy thing, it just makes them impossible to deal with. And everyone's got at least one of those things. And no one knows typically they got one, because one thing about your crazy thing is you typically don't recognize your crazy thing. Other people typically do, though, but not always. And so when you're dealing with people, going back to that idea, there's usually two ways to deal with people. One is you can push all their buttons in the bad way and engage them and have to fight and battle them to get things, to accomplish things. Or, if you know about a person, you can know how to avoid creating that needless confrontation, that needless trouble. For example, suppose you have a coworker, and suppose you're marginally above them, in like the corporation. So you can technically like tell them to do stuff, but you're not really far above them, so they don't really like to think of themselves as your subordinate. And suppose you got to get something done for a big meeting, and they don't like being ordered around. So if you go to them and say, just tell them to do it, you treat them like a lesser person, they will resist. Not to your face, but they will make things go slow and make things go bad. And so when you go to the presentation, it's going to suck. Or you could treat them like a person, on an equal level, and say, hey, we really, we got to get this done. We got to work as a team. Let's get this done. And then the sort of person that if you approach them that way, they'll give you 110%. So why create an enemy when you can much easier have a good ally? And that's kind of the Taoist approach. If you know yourself and know people and things, you know how to approach them. So why bash against walls? Why bash against people when there's much easier ways to accomplish what you wish? Again, it's not cutting corners and slacking things. It's just why beat your head against a wall? Which is an interesting approach. Interestingly though, people seem to choose to bash their heads against walls and bash their heads against other people. See it all the time. As people interact, and I'll say, well, they both know each other, and they're, oh, there they go. They go, and they're setting off each other's, crazy thing. It's just going to get crazy and awful from here. There it goes, even crazier, and more crazy. But again, to be fair, we all have our crazy thing that sets us off, and part of life is trying to figure out what that is, so your crazy thing doesn't take over your life. And it can lead to death. That's a good thing to find out. And some people have like a whole stack of crazy things. Another similar thing for the Tao is the notion of emptiness. Now, normally, of course, in Tao, the Taoists often, think in terms or speak in terms of what seems like paradoxes. Like talking about like the strength of water. But of course, water seems kind of weak because it avoids stuff. But actually, that's kind of smart. Well, water's not smart, but that's the metaphor. Now, we normally think of emptiness as a bad thing. For example, if I go to, get my water bottle and like, no, it's empty. Or Mother Hubbard goes to the cupboard and finds that it's bare. Or you go to your bank account, you're like, oh crap, you got a 0.00. So I often think of empty as bad. But, again, with kind of the Taoist love of like seeing paradoxes, they say the Taoists like emptiness, which may seem like kind of bad, but it's not the emptiness of like your bank account being empty or like your cupboards being empty. It's empty in a good way. Because as the Taoists like to point out, it is the emptiness of many things that actually makes them useful. For example, even though I like my water bottle to like have water, it is the emptiness of the bottle itself that makes it able to carry water. If it was just a solid cylinder of metal, I could not carry any water. Similarly, it is the emptiness of my backpack that enables me to carry stuff. It is the emptiness of this room that enables us to be in the room. This is just a block of brick. We would just be looking at it from the outside. So what is the Tao like? Well, we'll finish with this. The Tao is supposed to have all kinds of unusual qualities and do all kinds of strange things. So next time we'll pick up with the Tao. So we'll finish up the Tao next time and then start on 4. So be sure, in terms of close the deadline, be sure by the end of day 9 we'll finish Exam 2, covering Part 2, and this is Part 3, which will cover the Part 3